Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to see so many of you here at PRONI today. My aim is to take you on a journey of exploration and discovery of one of the most iconic buildings in Belfast, that of the bank buildings. My presentation will focus on the site, the people who are involved in its development, the buildings that have stood there over time, whilst having a look at the many events that have taken place in the history of our city during the time the buildings have stood there. So let's go. Since the catastrophic fire, which broke out on Tuesday 20th of August 2018, destroying the building that stood on the site until that date, much speculation and comment has been put forward about the building, and we have come to know so well as the premier business address in the city centre. Some have claimed it to be more than 300 years old. Others have speculated about where its name came from, whilst most remember it as a prestigious department store. But what I intend to do today is to analyse and clarify all that speculation and bring you the truth behind the facade. So, where to begin? Let's start with the first bank buildings on the site. Yes, there were 3 bank buildings, but who built them and why? The first bank buildings was erected in 1787 at the top of Castle Place, or as had been known since 1680, part of High Street, through which the River Façade flowed on its way to the Lagan and hence the sea. It is, however, important that we should study what stood on the site before that. Sir Arthur Chichester's castle of 1611, known as Belfast Castle, a rebuild from the earliest of times, stood on the south side of the river, surrounded by a walled garden, whilst a group of buildings terminated to the west end at what was later to become the bank buildings, whilst Hercules Lane ran off to the north. King William was received here and admired the building and its grounds so much that he chose to spend 5 days here in 1690 on his way to the banks of another infamous river in County Louth, where he would participate in a battle, the result of which would change all our lives on this island forever. In any event, the original Belfast Castle was destroyed by fire in 1708, after which the owners of the town, the Chichester family, returned to Fisherwick Hall, their family seat in England, and they became absentee landlords, largely due to the fact that 3 of the 4th Earl of Donegal's 6 sisters died in the blaze. The lands on which the castle had stood therefore became ripe for development. And so, enter one Waddell Cunningham, one of the town's wealthiest merchants who lived in a fine residence in Hercules Place, where the Provincial Bank of Ireland was later erected in 1864. Most of us will know this today as Tesco on Royal Avenue. Cunningham had made his fortune in the American colonies as a young man before returning to Ireland to become one of the leading figures in the development of 18th century Belfast. He had, rather controversially as we now see it, made much of his fortune from slave trading and had acquired a plantation of his own which he named Belfast on the island of Dominica in the Caribbean. Fortunately, his plan to introduce slave trading in the port of Belfast was rejected, mostly due to the determination of Belfast Presbyterian community, as is seen here by Thomas McCabe denouncing Waddell Cunningham's proposed slave ship company in the Old Exchange of 1786, and Latteray, of course, that is the head office of the Belfast Bank. Like most of the town's citizens, Cunningham was also Presbyterian, served as an Irish volunteer, was instrumental in founding Belfast Royal Academy, and challenged the establishment of the 1780s by standing for the Irish Parliament against the candidate of his landlord, the Earl of Donegal. This did not hold him back, however, and in 1789 he entered into property development, commissioning one of the leading Irish architects of the day, Sir James Hunter, to design a fine commodious Georgian building of 3 stories, situated on the banks of the Façade, facing east towards High Street, through which the river flowed. Hunter had previously worked on Carrickfergus Courthouse and jail in the days when Carrick was, of course, of much more importance than the town of Belfast. The new building, you see it at the top, was very much designed for commercial use, as befitted Cunningham's status and position in the town as a leading merchant. It certainly commanded one of the finest positions, vying in importance with the nearby Donegal Arms Hotel further down the street, which was used for the meetings of the fashionable societies of the day. Only a decade after the bank buildings had been erected, the Donegal Arms, which was used during the 1798 rebellion as the provost prison from where prisoners, such as Henry Joy McCracken, were taken to the gallows on the opposite side of the street outside the market house, which you can see on the right, where Dunn's Stores now stands. So where did the name come from? It did not come from the fact that the new building was built on the banks of the Façade, although Bank Lane, which still makes its way down Kelly's cellars today, can claim that honour. It was down to the founding of an early financial institution that the name the bank buildings came from. Modern banking, as such, did not exist in Belfast prior to 1751 until the first lending institution was established in that year by Daniel Musenden of Larchfield, Thomas Bateson of Beaver, and James Adair. It was Daniel's wife, Frida's wife, you can see on the right here, whose scandalous relationship with the Earl Bishop of Derry will be remembered more as the person who gave her name to the Musenden Temple overlooking Port Stewart Strand. Musenden's bank only lasted 6 years until 1757, after which Belfast's second banking institution, the Bank of the Four Johns, was established in 1787, and there are no prizes for guessing where that name came from. The second bank had been established in Cooney's Court, off Ann Street, and such was its success that the partners were soon looking to expand, and this is where Mr. Cunningham was only too happy to step in and oblige. Although the Bank of the Four Johns was successful in the short term in the new premises, which incidentally now stood on the renamed Grand Parade, so called because of the use of military displays, as you can see here, by 1796 3 of the Johns, with the exception of John Hamilton, had retired, and once again from 1797 to 1804 there were no bankers practising in Ulster. So, how do you may ask how were financial matters conducted? Well, during this void, landlords of Belfast refused to accept rent payments from their tenants in anything other than gold. So where did that leave the bank buildings? After the closure of the bank, Cunningham, in a shrewd move, converted the building into a private residence, which duly became the palace of the Bishop of Down and Connor of the established Church of Ireland, one of the Presbyterians' greatest adversaries. Cunningham was less bothered by this conflict of interest, however, and soon the very Reverend William Dixon moved in. The bishop, in the earliest days in his episcopate, resided at Purrisburn in the county of Down, and Purrisburn House is just to the right there, but chose to move into the centre of town in 1798 at the time of rebellion. It was from the windows of his first floor rooms that he would sit composing his sermons while surveying the high street of the day. The bishop's accommodation were described as consisting of an elegant hall, parlour, kitchen, pantries, cellars, etc. on the ground floor, a drawing room and 2 large bedrooms on the first floor and 4 additional bedrooms on the second floor. The area around Donegal Place, or Linen Hall Street as it was actually named until 1804, still played host to many of the homes of wealthy influential families of the town, such as the mansion house of Sir Stephen May, Controller of Customs, which stood directly opposite Castle Street on the site of what later became Anderson Macaulay's. However, following the turn of the 19th century, the area quickly fell prey to the commercial needs of the town, and upon the death of Bishop Dixon in September 1804, the bank buildings were used rather bizarrely as a venue for public exhibitions and entertainment, where such acts as an animated rope dancer with an automation that played the piano could be viewed and enjoyed by the masses. By 1804, the Belfast Newsletter announced that the premises were once again undertaking some alterations, with the ground floor being converted into 3 shops. Cunningham had died in 1897. I was another leading merchant at the time, Adam McLean, whose father had been the owner of the original market house in High Street that became the owner of the bank buildings. Here we can see where McLean had received a few pieces of most fabulous colours, and indeed had an additional shop to let the bank buildings with a stable of 4 horses on the manager's entry. McLean had made his fortune as a woolen draper, but perhaps his greatest contribution to Belfast, although being a Presbyterian, is that of being one of the benefactors on the land on which St Malachy's Roman Catholic Church was built, giving an insight into the enlightened times which existed in Ulster at that time. The upper floors of the building were also served as a boarding school under the watchful eye of Mrs. Ware, a formidable lady who didn't suffer any dissent from her staff, as you can see from these articles, taking to the local newspapers to warn others of her experiences about employing Margaret Dougal, a housemaid, claiming she had a character most infamous. I don't think any employers would get away with that, such practices today. The next occupant of the bank buildings was another financial institution that would be in keeping with the building's name and original use. Montgomery's Bank, as was locally known, had been established on the 1st of June 1809 as a private bank in a small house in Donegal Place by Hugh Montgomery, John Hamilton, James Orr and John Sloan. And such was the success of this bank that it went on to become the first joint stock bank in Ireland, when, by deed of partnership, it became known as the Northern Banking Company Limited in 1824, moving to its new premises in 1825, and of course we all know the Northern today as Danske Bank. Because of the layout of the building, the main entrance and trading address was on Castle Street. Although the building served admirably as the bank's new head office, the movement of the centre of trade and commerce towards the river and emerging port of Belfast, the directors of the Northern decided to devote £14,000 of their assets to developing a new head office at the prominent junction of Victoria Street and Queen's Square, which you can see here, both of which of course have been named after the royal visit of 1849. Their new building was rapidly nearing completion in October 1851, and by the summer of 1852 the bank had vacated their former premises at Castle Place. What should also be noted that both the Ulster Bank and Belfast Banking Company, their competitors, had equally impressive premises nearby on Waring Street, which should explain why such magnificent buildings are found on such a small street. Now, enter two young men who quickly saw the potential of the location of the vacant building for the establishment of their new business as haberdashers, woolen drapers and silk merchants, setting up a new partnership trading as Hawkins Robertson Company in 1853, and here we have one of their first advertisements in the local press from that year. The partnership specialised in silks, shawls and mantles, and the population of Belfast were respectfully invited to view. Henry Hawkins from Belfast and William Robertson, originally from Ayrshire in Scotland, who had previously successfully traded in Waterford, lived above the shop as it were in the early days of the business. Hawkins having an address in Castle Street, the original Northern Bank address, whilst Robertson lived behind the shop, or above the shop, on Bank Lane. This new breed of merchant, or entrepreneur as we would call them today, were no doubt influenced and spurred on by the success of other shop owners in the town, such as John Robb, who had opened in Castle Place in 1851, and John Arnott on Bridge Street in 1837. Most were Scots Presbyterian in stock, Arnott too having first made his money in Cork before coming up to Belfast. The 1850s brought about incredible changes in Belfast. The American Civil War meant that cotton could no longer be imported from America, so the merchants of Belfast quickly turned to the growing of flax, a plant much more suited to our climate, and the spinning of flax and the production of linen was born. This had a profound effect on those responsible for selling the finished product, and soon companies such as Robinson and Cleaver and J.N. Richardson, Sons and Oden were beginning to export products of Irish manufacture across the globe. Not wishing to be left behind, Hawkins and Robertson, prompted by their almost immediate success in selling to the Belfast public, decided that the ageing bank buildings no longer fitted in with their plans for expansion, and it was decided not to move, after all they had the most central business address in the town, but to demolish the original bank building and rebuild on the site. And so, the second bank buildings was born, and this is the one that most people are unaware of. The name Bank Buildings was retained as the businesses started trading as Hawkins Robertson and Company of the Bank Buildings. The new building was erected in the style of palazzo of an Italian banker, surely not another coincidence, as another architect, Charles Lanyon, was to repeat many times in the buildings he designed around Belfast in the same style for many decades to follow. The new building of 1855 was 4 stories in height and 7 bays wide, standing at the top of Castle Place as the thoroughfare had been renamed in 1840. Expansion along Castle Street and Bank Lane was inevitable and soon took place on a consistent basis over the period of the next 50 years. Such expansion required additional capital, and Hawkins Robertson bought into the partnership another Belfast man, Robert Ferguson, changing the name of the business to Hawkins Robertson Ferguson and Company. Their main business was that of the wholesale and retail woolen drapers, silk merchants and general warehouse men. Note, no mention of department store. That was a concept that didn't really come about until the early years of the 20th century. The success of the firm was of course mirrored by that of the partners of the firm. Only 5 years after establishing, Henry Hawkins had joined the other wealthy merchants of the town by moving to one of the most fashionable addresses at that time, which was College Square North, opposite the Royal Belfast Academical Institution. His neighbours would have included Henry Campbell of Campbell and Sons of Mossley, flax spinners and later the benefactors of Campbell College, and Bernard, or perhaps you better know him as Barney Hughes, of the Model Bakery on the Springfield Road. He was the first Roman Catholic to hold office on the town council and inventor of purveyor, of course, of the Belfast bat. By 1863, William Robertson had moved out of town to Penryn at Strandtown, whilst Robert Ferguson had purchased a fine new house and estate at Sydenham, known as Maryville, and you may remember that as being the site of the Anglo-Irish Secretariat in the 1980s. Henry Hawken joined his partners and many of Belfast's industrialists when he moved to the fashionable suburb of Strandown, building for himself a large villa named Kinneeder beside Belmont Presbyterian Church, and later was the home of Sir Aldo Jaffa, who served as our only Jewish Lord Mayor. To give you some idea of the various bank buildings, we have throughout their history on the site is an image from 1864 showing that Belfast was not without its sectarian troubles even then. Such disturbances flared up in 1857, 1864 and 1872, but it was unusual to see major rioting in the town centre as experienced on Grand Parade, as portrayed in the sketch. In 1871, the population of Belfast had increased to 174,412. A decade earlier, the census of 1861 had shown it only to be 121,000. So the town continued to enjoy unprecedented growth in demand for consumer products. The many assistants employed by the bank buildings were housed in a dwelling house in Chichester Street, the site of which was later occupied by Reuben Payne's Drapery Bazaar and is now a branch of the ubiquitous Cafe Nero. By this time, Robert Ferguson had also moved to Strandtown, where he purchased Sydenham House, which he purchased from Conway B. Grimshaw of the Linfield Spinning Mills and a descendant of Nicholas Grimshaw of White House. Sydenham House was situated just off Gelston's Corner. I have a nice photograph of it there. One of the most fashionable suburbs of Belfast at that time. In 1875, the business brought into partnership a new investor by the name of James Crawford Ledley. Ledley was a courtman who had worked up as a manager in Castle Place, and his native home would later bring future prosperity to the bank buildings as a company. 3 years later, the death occurred of one of the original founders, Henry Hawkins, on the 4th of October 1878 at the age of 66. Hawkins died at his residence Kinneeder on Strandown and was buried in the family plot at the city cemetery, where 3 generations of the family are to be found, all bearing the same name, Henry Hawkins, the youngest of which was his grandson, who died at the age of 10 months in 1884. His wife had been a keen gardener at Kinneeder and made a regular appearance at the Newton Arts flower show of the Chelsea of its day, where in September 1879 she won several prizes under the title Amateurs with a Gardener, a rather humorous description which in effect read like a who's who of Ulster society, with names such as Yurt of Glenbank, Lions of Old Park and Cleland of Stormont Castle, all picking up firsts in horticulture. Like many of his contemporaries, Hawkins' final resting place is that of to be found in Belfast City Cemetery on the Falls Road, the burial ground of the great and good from Belfast from 1st of August 1869 onwards, and you can see a photograph of those there. After Hawkins' death, the business was converted to a limited liability company, styled as Robertson, Ledley, Ferguson and Company. This is the name that remains above the entrance to the current building to this day, and actually is still there behind the barricades. The address at that time was 1 to 25 Castle Street and 14 to 24 Bank Lane, showing the extent to which the business had extended backwards from the main building of 1855. Their massive warehouse occupied from front to rear a distance of 300 feet, while it was 80 feet in width, occupying in parallelogram form half an acre of ground, the total floor space extending to 3 acres. The bank buildings, occupying the most central business address in Belfast, benefited enormously from being positioned in the front of Castle Junction, where 1,200 cars from all over the town passed each day, and of course in those days trams were pulled around the town by horsepower, as you can see. We often think as the business trading at bank buildings as being a Belfast firm, but although by the stage their products were being exported all around the globe out of the port of Belfast, they soon wanted to expand the business to other cities in Ireland. Ledley led this expansion in Cork, where the company grew and opened the Munster Arcade, and it was here where he and his son grew the business in this important city. Robertson's origins in the drapery business in Waterford also led the company to open extensive premises in that city, along in Merchant's Quay, overlooking the River Suir. After conversion to a limited liability status, the directors determined to rebuild the premises once more, and started the search for one of the country's leading architects to provide designs for an even bigger building which would accommodate the business needs of the company into the next century. But why would they want to expand? This photograph, rather ghostly one, reveals why. Competition. On the right is the bank buildings, the second one, but fast approaching from along Castle Street is the massive bulk of one of their major competitors, Anderson Macaulay. Anderson Macaulay commenced trading on Donegal Place in 1861, and you see their original premises just here. And here's a fascinating shot of Donegal Place at that time. By 1895, however, such was the growth in their business that these premises could no longer cope with the demands on the resources of the company, and they commissioned Young and Mackenzie to design a massive new warehouse, which you saw building in the previous slide. Robinson and Cleaver, at the other end of the street, had also opened their Royal Irish Linen Warehouse in 1888. And note the presence of the White Linen Hall just to the right-hand side there in each of these photographs. It was not until 1906 that that building, of course, was replaced by today's City Hall. John Robb had extended his premises virtually along one side of Castle Place, whilst John Arnott had made such a success of his business on Bridge Street that he had taken himself off to Dublin and Cork to open even larger premises. So it was very much as a matter of pride and status that Robertson, Ledley and Ferguson felt they should follow suit, building an even larger and more impressive emporium than their competitors. W.H. Lynn designs meant that the new building could be erected in stages, working from the rear on Castle Street and moving forward. The wholesale side of the business operated from an entrance onto Castle Street, with dispatch being from Bank Street. On the ground, the first floors would be the retail areas specialising in linen, cambric and damask products of Irish manufacture, while the upper floors were used for the manufacturing process itself. The wholesale side of the business extended to all parts of the world, and the name of the firm became inseparable with the highest achievements of the Irish linen trade, being honoured by the patronage of Her Majesty the Queen, as well as nobility and gentry of the United Kingdom and Great Britain and Ireland. Although many improvements had been made in power loom weaving in the manufacture of linen products, hence the massive increase in looms in the mills of Belfast, much of the firm's manufacture of linen products was still carried out on hand looms, which were located on the upper floors of the bank buildings. And here you see the hand looms. In effect, the building was also what we would know as a factory. This produced much finer work being carried out than was possible using the newer technology of mass production in the weaving sheds of the mills. Robertson, Ledley and Ferguson vied with Robinson and Cleaver, one of the main competitors in this regard, both of them producing specially commissioned pieces of work which were presented to Queen Victoria on the occasion of her Golden Jubilee on the 20th of June 1887. The Jubilee doily, presented by Robinson and Cleaver, is held at the Irish Linen Museum in Lisburn, while Robertson, Ledley and Ferguson produced specially commissioned handkerchiefs for the use of Queen Victoria with the Order of the Garter and the letters VRI, Latin for, of course, for Queen and Empress, displayed in the corners, all surrounded by a border of rose, shamrock and thistle, symbolising the various parts of the UK. Even with its immense growth in size, the company remained under the control of the founding families. Robert Ferguson JP and his son James continued to live at Sydenham House in Strandtown, whilst William Robertson, the chairman of the company, commissioned the leading architect of the day, Lanyon, Lynn and Lanyon, to build an impressive new residence for himself in the grounds of the former Stormont estate of Sir Thomas McClure, who was a tobacco magnate. The rest of the estate at Belmont was purchased for the development of Campbell College, which opened in 1894 as a college for the purposes of giving there a superior liberal Protestant education, as were the wishes of the founder, Henry Campbell, whose family had made their fortune in flax spinning at Mossley, County Antrim. Netherley, as the new house was to be named, was built in 1875 and owes much of its appearance, probably not without coincidence, to W.H. Lynn, the future developer of the bank buildings itself at Castle Place, and the architect being behind Belfast Castle, of course. As with many mansion houses of the area, it was built on a prominence overlooking the town of Belfast and set in several acres of parkland with its own lake. By this stage, Robertson would of course have become a millionaire, but as said, he was somewhat of a retiring man. He is seen here with his large family in the grounds of Netherley, and again with his contemporaries at a pheasant shoot on the estate in the 1890s. He was a keen gardener and plantsman, furnishing the grounds of the estate with trees from all over the world, as can be confirmed by the size of the greenhouse at Netherley, which were almost as impressive as the glass houses at Botanic Gardens. Netherley survives today as remarkably good condition as the offices of the Department of the Economy at Massey Avenue beside Stormont. In August 1896, the death occurred of another one of the original founders, Robert Ferguson of Sydenham House, which subsequently passed to the executors of his will, Henry C. Craig, a distiller in the firm of Dunville and Company, and a brother of James Craig, the future Prime Minister of the new state of Northern Ireland. Ferguson's wife tragically died in 1887, and it was her memory he made a substantial donation to the building of what is now known as the Ferguson Memorial School and Belmont Tower. The school opened on the corner of Belmont Road and Belmont Church Road in 1892 and was designed by Vincent Craig, yet another brother of James Craig, Lord Craigavon. Robert Ferguson donated £1,000, which was an enormous sum in those days, to the Belmont Presbyterian Church Committee in order to build and furnish the school and enclose the ground as a memorial to my dear wife, and it should be named as such. So once again, the bank buildings was being seen to play an important part in the community. Today, after a long career as Belmont Primary School, the building is used by one of the regional offices of the National Trust. Like his contemporaries, Ferguson is buried in the city cemetery. His death did not, however, delay the plans of the company in their ongoing expansion plans for the company's headquarters at Castle Place. Lynn had commenced the rebuilding programme in 1885, starting at the rear of the premises, and he was once again commissioned to complete the project in 1889. The directors were clever to ensure that the business never closed, as they moved from the retail floors throughout the building as each section was demolished. Belfast at that time was reaching its zenith as one of the most important manufacturing cities in the British Empire, and Lynn, at the age of 71, set about designing a building that would encompass everything that Belfast represented in terms of recognition of its industrial might, but also that would be more appropriate to the new century. In doing so, he created what is often termed at Belfast's first skyscraper, as it used a cast iron frame over which the 5-storey building was built using red Dumfries sandstone, allowing great expanses of glass on the lower 2 floors, and thus the third bank buildings came into being. The new building for Robertson, Devin and Ferguson was officially opened in 1900 and soon became the focus for exclusive shopping in Edwardian Belfast. It monopolised its position in the area around Castle Place, Donegal Place and the newly formed Royal Avenue. Lynn, despite his age, demonstrated his ability to move with the times, as he had done many times before, for example, with the design of a warehouse for Richards and Sons in Odin, many years early on Donegal Square North. Many of you will know this now as Marks and Spencer. In 1905, the sole remaining founder of the firm and the driving force behind its success, William Robertson, died at his address in Netherley on 9th of February 1905. But his son James and William Jr. continued to represent the family on the board as directors with particular responsibility for the Waterford branch of the company. As a limited company, additional capital was often provided by outside investors, and in 1910, at the AGM held at the nearby Grand Central Hotel on Royal Avenue, Alex H. Ledley, the new chairman, addressed the meeting, of which shareholders such as James Mackey of the Albert Foundry on the Springfield Road and James Gallagher, a grain importer and brother of Thomas Gallagher, the Tobacco King, were present. Such was the attraction of the company for outside investors. It is important to remember that although the building portrayed a magnificent external appearance, it still performed the role of a manufactory on the upper and rear floors. The wholesale side of the business also played a major role, as it was from the rear of the premises which the company distributed the goods of Irish manufacture to many other retailers, not only in Ireland but also across the UK. Gradually, the skills required for handloom weaving became extinct, and the manufacturing side of the business was phased out in favour of an enlarged wholesale operation. It also housed a shirt factory and carpet and upholstery warehouse. As an institution, the Third Bank buildings have presided over some of the most important events in Ireland's history since it opened its doors onto Castle Place in 1900. At the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the building had catered for a very upwardly mobile Edwardian Belfast. The business had a string of wealthy clients across Europe and dominated the commercial heart of the city from its headquarters on Castle Place. However, stability on the island of Ireland had been greatly affected by the Home Rule crisis, and in the north, this led to the rise of the Ulster Volunteer Force in a bid to resist Home Rule. The bank buildings once again looked down over this incredibly difficult period in the country's history, and here's a shot of the UVF volunteers making their way down Donegal Place and turning right into Castle Place in front of the building in 1914. These volunteers would of course be incorporated into Kitchener's army at the outbreak of the Great War as the 36th Ulster Division of the British Army before being sent off to the Somme in 1916, thousands of which would never return home after the slaughter in the trenches of the First World War. 5 years later, and after the end of one of the most catastrophic events in modern European history, Castle Place played host to another momentous occasion in UK history, Peace Day, and that occurred on the 9th of August 1919, the Cellar Sentinel of which is being commemorated this year, or was commemorated this year. A contemporary report tells us the peace celebrations were held in Belfast on Saturday when a procession of 36,000 demobilised troops marched past the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, who was Viscount French at that stage, who had made his way up to Belfast from the Viceregal Lodge in Phoenix Park, Dublin. 250,000 spectators lined the streets. August 1919 was chosen because it would of course have been impossible to organise such a parade following the chaos of Europe following the devastating aftermath of the First World War. Today we remember those who gave the ultimate sacrifice during the war on Armistice Day as the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It was only at this stage in the early decades of the 20th century that the business went through the transition from linen warehouse to department store. The bank buildings remained throughout the 20s and 30s as a leading stockist of linen products, but as you can see from these advertisements of the time, the company diversified into more practical fabrics such as cotton, elevating linen into the status of a luxury good. In 1921, after several decades of political upheaval caused by the Home Rule crisis in Ireland, partition came about and the new state of Northern Ireland was established, with George V and Queen Mary visiting Belfast on the 22nd of June for the state opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament at City Hall. And here the royal carriage makes its way up. Here the royal carriage makes its way up Donegal Place, passing the bank buildings at Castle Place. The King and Queen, having arrived by royal yacht at Belfast docks, the department stores of the time took full advantage to welcome the royal visitors to the city, as can be seen by Royal Robertson and Cleaver's decorations on their building opposite City Hall on the day. In 1926, the front of the premises received an upgrade to that of an arcade. And why, do you ask, an arcade? Well, the bank buildings, ever competing with the other department stores of the city, noticed that shopping arcades were the new thing to hit the high street of Britain, and also gave the shop double the window display space by creating windows within a shop, as would have been by other leading entrepreneur of the city, Crawford McCulloch, at his Art Nouveau Emporium on Castle Place as early as 1906. And you can see the arcade principle just on the right hand side there, which later became Castle Buildings, and that building still stands today. The roaring 20s and 30s were the golden age of the department stores. The older Victorian premises, Robinson and Cleaver and Anderson Macaulay, found they too had to evolve, and although they kept many of their original features, as you can see here, they were soon introducing fashion shows with afternoon tea in order to stay ahead of their competitors. And you can see again an interior of the 1920s and the 30s. Here is one facility, however, that every department store had to have. A ladies' and often gents' hairdressing department. The well-heeled of the city flocked into the bank buildings to have their hair styled in the latest fashion. In this case, it was the Marcel wave. Further down Royal Avenue, the most recent competitor to enter the scene was Sinclair's department store, which had been just completed its magnificent Art Deco extension onto the original premises of a business commenced in 1900, so the race was on. The opulence and excitement of the 30s, however, was suddenly brought to a shuddering halt by the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939-40. Easter for 1941, the Luftwaffe caused massive destruction to the city during air raids launched over Belfast, directly hitting many of the bank building's main competitors. Arnott's department store, which you can see on the left here, on High Street, one of the most impressive in the city, was completely destroyed. But somehow the bank buildings managed once again to escape the carnage meted out to the city of Belfast in that year. Austerity soon became the order of the day, and this period shot taken in 1942 shows for the first time the effects of trading in wartime Belfast, with the building's expansive glass and plate glass windows covered up, whilst across Castle Street and in Macaulay's basement was converted to serve as an air raid shelter. That was for those working in the city, with a specially created access point under its famous windows. The love that was felt for most of Belfast citizens for the building was once again demonstrated in a more joyous occasion at the end of the Second World War on VE, which is Victory Endured Day of course, on Wednesday 8th of May 1845, when hundreds of thousands of people from all over the country made their way to City Hall to hear Churchill's speech relayed around Donegal Square, marking the formal acceptance by the Allies of the Second World War of Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender of its armed forces. The joyous celebrations continued throughout the day and into the night in Belfast city centre, with the BBC dispatching Lieutenant Commander Harry McMullen to broadcast his impressions of the street scenes in Belfast, following Churchill's broadcast from the first floor balcony of the bank buildings, as you can see in this iconic shot. You can just imagine the sheer relief that after 5 years of the world having been at war, the end had almost arrived. During the 1950s, the country got back to relative normality, but it was during this time that many changes came about in retailing in Belfast. Although the family-controlled department stores had supplied the citizens of Belfast with much of their needs for almost a century, the new breed of multiple stores were looking to expand their empires into the parts of the UK, and Northern Ireland, of course, was no exception. One of the first to arrive was C&A Modes, which arrived in Donegal Place in 1955, followed by Littlewoods in Ann Street and the British Home Stores on Castle Lane. The bank buildings continued to expand under the directorship of Robertson, Ledley and Ferguson, with the erection of Commonwealth House to the rear of the premises on Castle Street in 1958. This time it was for office space for the continued growing company, but also for the provision of office space for letting out to other organisations. Following the arrival of the new multiples, the long-established family-controlled department stores also came under the scrutiny of their mainland competitors. And soon Sir Isaac Bolson's great Universal Stores had taken over Rob's on the left on Castle Place, with Sears Holdings acquiring the shares of Robson Cleaver. The bank buildings, however, went about its daily business of fashion shows, afternoon tea in its restaurant, and of course with an appearance by Santa at Christmas time. And there we have the fashion shows taking place, and there we have Santa. And there's no prizes for guessing who the young man sitting in Santa's knee is. The bank buildings, as one of the city's most exclusive stores, was no exception, coming again under the eye of another major UK retailer, that of Sir Hugh Fraser. So for those of you who thought that the arrival of House of Fraser in Victoria Centre in 2008 was a first for the city, just look at this advertisement of almost 50 years earlier in 1961, proclaiming that House of Fraser had just acquired 91% of the ordinary shares of Robertson, Ledley and Ferguson of Belfast and Cork, a bid amounting to just over £1.5 million, which was an enormous amount in those days, showing the value placed on the business at that time. Today's equivalent of that purchase would be around 33 million. House of Fraser had been established in a small shop in Argyle Street in Glasgow in 1849, and under the direction of the founder's grandson Sir Hugh, its rapid expansion saw the acquisition of such names as Dickon and Jones, Army and Navy, and in 1957 perhaps the most prestigious name in retailing across the globe, that being of Harrods in London. With the backing of such a prestigious parent company, the bank buildings underwent a massive refurbishment on its 108th birthday in 1961. The year it became a House of Fraser store. Northern Ireland was experiencing peaceful and prosperous times at that time, and Belfast is a desirable place for cross-channel businesses. Nelson McMillan, a former chairman of the Northern Ireland Tourist Board, headed the new subsidiary company, which still traded under the name Robertson, Ledley and Ferguson, but big changes were planned under the new owner. Here you can see the new shopfront fitted to the store in 1961, and like so many of the city's other department stores, by the 1960s the massive glass plate windows had gone out of fashion, and surprisingly the original large windows were reduced in size, perhaps to make the window shopper more focused on the items on display. Until 1961, the upper floors of the building were still used as the company's wholesale and dispatch department, but this was being phased out in new sales floors laid out. Harrods' continued success as a food retailer in Knightsbridge also prompted the idea of returning to pre-war policy of selling food at Castle Place. The double-sided arcade front of 1928 was removed, allowing the modern housewife, as she was termed, direct access to the ground floor, whilst the first floor features soft furnishings, linens, china, glass and cutlery. Another sign of the times was the introduction of a new confectionery and tobacco counter on the ground floor close to the main staircase. And there we have the interior in the 1960s. The opening of any new department in any department store in Belfast in the 1960s was certainly a special occasion. None of the leaders in this field would let an opportunity go without much pomp and ceremony, and here's a classic example of when the bank buildings opened their new man store in June 1967. The latest prestige cars, accompanied by a full brass band, and of course the obligatory fashion models, made their way through the city centre in a colourful cavalcade on a Saturday afternoon. In the 70s, the bank buildings, like so many other businesses in the city centre, was suffering from the bombing campaign, and it was almost a daily occurrence. Here's an excellent shot of the area around Castle Place before the decision was taken to restrict vehicular access to the centre of town and impose a ring of steel around the city centre. You can see the windows of the bank buildings have been blown in several times due to terrorist attacks having been launched at the former nearby Grand Central Hotel, which was occupied by the army from 1971 until 1981. It was a direct terrorist attack actually on the bank buildings on the evening of Tuesday 9th of April 1975 that forced House of Fraser to re-evaluate their expansion plans for the brand in Northern Ireland. These bombs exploded on the top floor of the building at 5:20, 5:25 and 5:27, sending flames and clouds of smoke and hundreds of feet into the night sky. 9 appliances and hundreds of firefighters took 4 hours to bring the building the fire under control, and preventing a 7,000-gallon fuel tank from being set alight by the blaze which followed. So it may come as a surprise that the bank buildings was previously badly damaged by fire within living memory. Even though the firefighters were prevented from tackling the blaze for 45 minutes because of the justified fear of further explosions, the building did survive on that occasion, as it had done throughout many of history's other events opening for business the next day. With the damage repaired and the building restored, the business continued to trade as House of Fraser store for several years until 1979, when the staff were told that the store was to close for stock taking in preparation for a closing down sale which the building was going to be sold to Premark. So, who was Premark? Pennies had been established in Mary Street in Dublin in June 1969 by the Weston family, who saw a market for inexpensive clothing which would compete with contemporary retailers. Their first foray into Northern Ireland was to this historic building in Donegal Place in 1971. This had been the headquarters of the Brand Group since 1934, the business having been founded by Thomas Brand on Royal Avenue in 1898. The building later became known as Brand's Arcade, and the rather uniquely named Birdcage Walk, which you may remember. Peter and his brother Paddy were leaders in ladies' fashion in the swinging 60s of Belfast. By the 70s, however, the outbreak of civil unrest and the subsequent bombing campaign led the directors to close Donegal Place, focusing on Brands and Normans on Castle Lane, and it was to this environment that Pennies first entered the UK market. And I'm sure many of you have fond memories of these lovely structures on Donegal Place. When they attempted to expand to Darby with their first store in the UK, however, their use of the Pennies name was challenged by Jcpenney, who had the name registered worldwide outside Ireland, and the company was forced to change the name to Premark, or, if you live in England, Primark. Such was their phenomenal success in clothing retailing that they were in a position in 1979, despite the difficulties posed to traders in the Belfast city centre at that time, so they could make House of Fraser an offer for the bank buildings in order that they could expand their Belfast operation. This was accepted, and Premark took occupation of the building later that year. To their credit, Premark spent an enormous amount of money restoring the bank buildings in order for them to make the buildings suitable for modern retailing. However, they had to strip out the original interior, which was no longer fit for purpose. The interiors, which had dramatically changed, however, throughout time in the previous 80 years, so there's not a great deal of Lynn's original fittings to hold on to. The new Premark store opened to great acclaim on the 1st of October 1980. Premark, at that time a subsidiary of Associated British Foods, purchased the building for a very reasonable £1 million. House of Fraser were glad to offload it for a change, but over the next 18 months spent over £5 million on its refurbishment. The interior was completely gutted, but the exterior was completely restored, with the exception of a little statue at the top which had disappeared somewhere in the 1960s. Premark operated the store for the next 38 years, only modifying the entrance facade once to incorporate their new style of name until that fateful day on Tuesday, 28th of August 2018, when the citizens of Belfast saw this. the bank buildings, was on fire. At first, horrified onlookers watched the drama unfold in front of them. It appeared that the Fire and Rescue Service had the blaze under control. But only a few hours later, the entire building was consumed in a blaze the likes of which Belfast had not seen for many decades. The aftermath was horrendous. The entire building of 1900 destroyed and left as a smouldering ruin. It was somewhat ironic that the blaze should have started at that time. However, Premark had only recently announced a £5 million extension to the original building on the site of what was previously Commonwealth House, which was demolished in 2016, having been a property development of Robertson, Leslie and Ferguson in the 1950s. And there you see Commonwealth House on Castle Street, if you remember it, and that was being demolished and rebuilt as the extension to the new store. Since then, the building has been isolated from the streets of the city centre, having had its top 2 floors removed as part of the planned conservation programme, which will see it rebuilt and hopefully take its place at Belfast's premier business address once more. It is this stage of my journey of discovery, ladies and gentlemen, that is ending for the moment. The future of the site, despite being embroiled in much controversy, is in very capable hands of the current building's owner, Premark. Conservation engineers are working daily to secure the historic building and restore it to its previous glory, conserving some of the amazing pieces of stonework that have been part of the building for the last 118 years, and you see that very much in this photograph. What I do hope is that you have enjoyed the journey we have embarked upon this evening, or this afternoon should I say, looking at the history of one of the most iconic buildings in Belfast and the people that have shaped not only the buildings on the site, but have taken part in the events that have created Belfast as a city over the past 2 centuries. Thank you very much.